The bitter reality of racial discrimination doesn't disappear at cruising altitude. It merely takes a different form. Flight attendants who assume your ticket must be fraudulent, questioning that wouldn't happen to others, and the silent complicity of fellow passengers who witness injustice but choose comfort over courage. When 16-year-old Alexandria took her legitimately purchased first-class seat, she became the latest victim of an all-too-familiar pattern. But this time, the wrong passenger was profiled. Alexandria sat quietly in seat 3B, her navy backpack nestled in her lap. This honors student had earned this first-class ticket from her godmother Victoria after excelling in an advanced science program. The cabin's peaceful atmosphere contrasted with her slight nervousness about flying alone for the first time. Flight attendant Ms. Reynolds approached, her professional smile evaporating upon seeing Alexandria. "You're in the wrong seat," she announced loudly, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "No, I think this is my seat," Alexandria replied softly, presenting her boarding pass. Ms. Reynolds scanned it dismissively. "This must be a mistake," she declared with unconcealed skepticism. "There's no way. You need to move now." Despite Alexandria's polite insistence, Ms. Reynolds grew increasingly hostile. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but you're holding up boarding. Take your things and move to the back." The cabin fell silent. Passengers averted their eyes or watched with detached interest as Alexandria gathered her belongings and walked the humiliating gauntlet to economy class, her dignity stripped with each step. Once seated in the cramped rear section, Alexandria texted her godmother. "She made me leave my seat. Said I didn't belong. I'm in the back now." What Ms. Reynolds couldn't know was that Victoria wasn't just any concerned guardian. She was Victoria Bennett, Director of Aviation Safety at the Federal Aviation Authority. "Flight number?" came Victoria's terse reply. Within minutes of receiving the information, Victoria's influence reached the cockpit. The captain received an urgent directive: ground the aircraft immediately. An official compliance investigation had been initiated. This wasn't just about a seating dispute. It was about the insidious bias that had led Ms. Reynolds to single out Alexandria as not belonging in first class. Ms. Reynolds, initially smug about fixing what she perceived as a problem, dismissed a colleague's concern. "Lots of things look real. I've been doing this for 15 years. You learn to spot when something's off." But her certainty shattered when summoned to the cockpit. On the radio, FAA operations manager confronted her. "Did you verify her boarding pass with the manifest before removing her?" "No, but I made a judgment based on the situation." "You made a judgment based on what she looked like," came the damning response. Ordered to publicly apologize and restore Alexandria to her rightful seat, Ms. Reynolds approached the teenager with forced contrition. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Alexandria's response cut deep. "Confusion. You checked my ticket. You saw the seat number, and you still told me to move. Why did you assume I didn't belong? You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket. Just me. Why?" The question hung unanswered, exposing the ugly truth of what had happened. As Alexandria reclaimed her first-class seat, the weight of silence from fellow passengers, who had witnessed the injustice but said nothing, felt almost as heavy as Miss Reynolds's discrimination. Alexandria didn't seek revenge or satisfaction. She simply wanted acknowledgement of the truth. Her quiet dignity in the face of prejudice stood in stark contrast to Ms. Reynolds' crumbling facade. One passenger awkwardly offered, "I saw what happened. It was unfortunate." Alexandria's measured response spoke volumes. "You mean it was a choice?" By standing her ground and involving her powerful godmother, Alexandria had turned a personal humiliation into a moment of accountability. The flight remained grounded while Victoria's investigation continued, ensuring this wouldn't be just another unrecorded incident of discrimination at altitude. What began as one flight attendant's biased assumption resulted in an entire aircraft delayed, a federal investigation launched, and a powerful reminder that racial profiling carries consequences, not just for its victims, but eventually for those who perpetuate it. As the grounded plane sat on the tarmac, tension thickened throughout the cabin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued delay. We're working to resolve an onboard issue. We appreciate your patience." In the galley, Ms. Reynolds' colleagues maintained their distance, sensing the gravity of her situation. Her career flashed before her eyes, 15 years of service potentially undone by one moment of unchecked bias. Another flight attendant approached her cautiously. "What's happening? Why aren't we taking off?" Ms. Reynolds couldn't meet his gaze. "Federal investigation," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Meanwhile, Alexandria received another text from Victoria. "Officers boarding now. Stay calm." True to her word, 3 individuals in dark suits entered the aircraft. The lead agent, a woman with a commanding presence, spoke briefly with the captain before approaching Ms. Reynolds. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm Agent Carruthers from the FAA Civil Rights Division," she stated, her voice measured but authoritative. "We'll need your statement regarding today's incident." The passengers watched in stunned silence as the gravity of the situation became apparent. This wasn't just about a delayed flight anymore. This was about accountability. Alexandria remained composed, focusing on her book while aware of the whispers spreading through the cabin. Passengers now understood why they were grounded, and many began questioning their own silence during the incident. The suited woman who had earlier dismissed Alexandria's experience as unfortunate now leaned across the aisle. "I should have said something," she admitted, shame evident in her voice. "I saw what happened and stayed quiet." Alexandria regarded her thoughtfully. "Silence is acceptance," she replied simply. After 30 minutes of questioning, the lead agent approached Alexandria. "Ms. Bennett asked me to inform you that you have options. We can continue the investigation while allowing the flight to proceed, or we can rebook you on another flight with full accommodation provided." Alexandria considered this. "Will anything change if I leave?" "Your statement has been recorded. The investigation continues regardless." Alexandria nodded. "Then I'll stay. I have a science competition to attend." The agent smiled slightly. "Your godmother said you'd say that. She's very proud of you." As Ms. Reynolds returned to her duties, the change was palpable. Gone was her earlier arrogance, replaced by a subdued demeanor and visible discomfort. Before takeoff resumed, she was required to make a public announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice wavered slightly over the intercom, "I want to apologize for the delay in our departure today. I also want to extend a personal apology to one of our passengers who was incorrectly removed from her first-class seat due to my error in judgment. This incident is under investigation by federal authorities, and this airline maintains a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory practices." As the plane finally accelerated down the runway, Alexandria gazed out the window, reflecting on the day's events. What began as humiliation had transformed into something more significant. A moment of reckoning that might prevent someone else from experiencing the same treatment. 3 weeks later, Alexandria stood at a podium accepting first place in the regional science competition, her research on algorithmic bias earning praise from judges. Victoria beamed from the audience. That same day, across town, Ms. Reynolds sat in a mandatory sensitivity training session, one of several consequences from the FAA's investigation. The airline had placed her on probation, her personnel file now containing a formal reprimand. More importantly, the incident had catalyzed a company-wide review of implicit bias training for all flight staff. At dinner that evening, Victoria raised her glass to Alexandria. "To standing your ground," Alexandria smiled. "I learned from the best." "You know," Victoria said thoughtfully, "your experience has already changed things. The airline is implementing new verification protocols to prevent subjective judgments about who belongs where." Alexandria nodded, understanding the broader impact. "One person at a time." "Exactly. Systems don't change overnight, but they do change when someone refuses to accept injustice." What began as a teenage girl being wrongfully removed from her seat had evolved into something more powerful. A reminder that accountability matters, that silence enables discrimination, and that sometimes the most effective response to prejudice isn't loud protest but quiet, unwavering dignity backed by those with the power to demand change. 3 months later, Alexandria would publish an essay about her experience that went viral, reaching millions and sparking conversations about the everyday indignities faced by people of color in spaces where they're presumed not to belong. The airline would eventually use the incident in their own training materials as a case study on how not to treat passengers. But on that night, Alexandria simply savored her victory, both in the science competition and in that moment on the plane when she asked the question no one wanted to answer. Why did you assume I didn't belong? It was a question that would continue to echo, forcing uncomfortable but necessary reflection in everyone who heard her story. Alexandria's essay, titled "The Empty Seat Next to Me on Belonging and Invisibility at 30,000 Feet," created seismic waves far beyond what she initially anticipated. Published first in her school newspaper, the piece quickly gained traction when a prominent civil rights attorney shared it on social media. Within 72 hours, it had been viewed over 5 million times across platforms, translated into 12 languages, and republished by major news outlets. The essay's impact was multifaceted. First, it humanized statistics. While studies had long documented discriminatory treatment in commercial aviation, Alexandria's meticulously detailed account, her calm recollection of Ms. Reynolds' changing facial expressions, the silence of fellow passengers, the physical sensation of walking the aisle in shame, transformed abstract data into visceral experience. Readers couldn't distance themselves from her narrative. Second, it sparked a nationwide conversation about everyday discrimination. Alexandria's hashtag #SheWhoLooksLikeTheyBelong became a trending topic, with thousands sharing similar experiences of being questioned in spaces where they were legitimately present. Upscale stores, exclusive neighborhoods, professional settings, and various modes of transportation. Third, it catalyzed industry change. 4 major U.S. airlines announced comprehensive reviews of their training protocols within weeks of the essay's publication. 2 international carriers implemented new verification systems specifically designed to eliminate subjective judgments about passengers. The Association of Flight Attendants issued a formal statement acknowledging the problem and committed to addressing implicit bias in their professional development curriculum. Perhaps most significantly, Alexandria's essay changed how incidents of bias were discussed in public forums. Her precise language, refusal to escalate emotionally, and focus on systemic rather than personal failings provided a template for discussing discrimination without defensive deflection. She hadn't written to villainize Ms. Reynolds, but to illuminate the environment that made her actions possible. When Alexandria was invited to speak at a transportation industry conference 6 months later, she addressed a room of executives with the same composed dignity she'd shown on the aircraft. The question isn't whether bias exists in your organization. It does in all of us. The question is what systems you've implemented to prevent individual bias from becoming institutional discrimination. Her essay became required reading in college courses spanning sociology, business ethics, and communication. Several corporate training programs adopted it as a case study. By focusing not just on the incident, but on the silence of bystanders, Alexandria had created an entry point for those who might otherwise have remained defensive. As Victoria had observed that night after the science competition, systems don't change overnight, but they do change when someone refuses to accept injustice and knows precisely how to articulate that injustice in ways that make it impossible to ignore. Alexandria's essay indeed catalyzed significant legislative action, though not in the immediate dramatic fashion of landmark civil rights legislation. Instead, it influenced policy through a more nuanced path that reflected the essay's own measured approach to exposing systemic bias. Within 6 months of publication, 3 key legislative developments emerged. First, Representative Eleanor Vasquez, who had experienced similar discrimination while traveling to Washington, introduced the Equitable Access in Transportation Act, EATA, which directly cited Alexandria's experience. This bill proposed expanded data collection requirements for transportation providers to track and report incidents of potential discrimination, creating accountability through transparency. The legislation mandated quarterly public reporting of customer service interactions, flagged for bias concerns, with penalties for companies showing persistent patterns without remediation efforts. Second, Alexandria's essay became central evidence during a pivotal House Transportation Committee hearing on consumer protections in commercial aviation. The teenager herself was invited to testify, where her poised articulation of the incident provided legislators with rare first-person insight into discrimination that typically went undocumented. Her testimony proved particularly effective because she focused on measurable, actionable solutions rather than punitive measures. "What happened to me wasn't exceptional," Alexandria told the committee. "What was exceptional was having a godmother with enough influence to stop a plane. Most people suffering discrimination have no such recourse, which is why we need structural protections, not just individual remedies." Third, and perhaps most concretely, 4 state legislatures used Alexandria's framework to strengthen their public accommodation laws. California passed the Right to Equal Service Act, enhancing penalties for businesses that couldn't demonstrate consistent verification procedures across demographic groups. The law specifically addressed discretionary questioning, the practice of selectively requesting additional verification from some customers but not others. Beyond these formal legislative actions, Alexandria's essay influenced policy implementation in regulatory agencies. The Department of Transportation issued new guidance for airlines on bias prevention, and the FAA expanded its civil rights compliance reviews. These administrative actions, while not requiring new legislation, significantly strengthened enforcement of existing anti-discrimination statutes. Perhaps most telling was how Alexandria's essay changed the legislative conversation itself. Whereas previous discrimination hearings often devolved into partisan disputes about the existence or extent of bias, her account proved difficult to dismiss or politicize. The measured tone of her writing, combined with the undeniable documentation of the incident through the FAA investigation, short-circuited traditional political resistance. As Senator James Moreland noted during budget hearings, "We're not debating whether discrimination exists anymore. Thanks to accounts like Alexandria's, we're now focused where we should be, on creating systems that prevent it, identify it when it happens, and provide meaningful remedies." By 2026, the ETA passed with bipartisan support, a rarity in transportation legislation, with Alexandria invited to the signing ceremony. The Alexandria Amendment, as it became informally known, established the first national database tracking discrimination complaints across transportation sectors, finally providing the statistical visibility needed to address patterns that individual anecdotes alone couldn't expose.